Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of our Transportation Symposium 2021. My name is Dr. Trevor Townsend, Senior Lecturer in Transportation Engineering, Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, Faculty of Engineering, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this third day of our symposium. Just in case you've joined us for the first time, the purpose of the symposium was really to have the multidisciplinary development of an action agenda for the transformation of the domestic transportation sector of Trinidad and Tobago. We've had 2 great days, with day 1 with some fantastic presentations, some of our expert presenters in the areas of green transport, private sector participation, ITS in future mobility, revitalizing towns, road transport safety. And we had a workshop that was very well attended, a number of workshops yesterday. I think that everybody felt that, they could have even done it more time, but of course we have to limit it in terms of how much time we can do things. And today we are going to carry it one step further, in that we have brought back all the workshop agendas, all the workshop documents, and we are going to be having presentations in each area. And the structure of today's session is going to be very straightforward. We're going to have a presentation on the area, and then we're going to have a short Q&A. And after we've gone through all 5 areas, we are going to have a general plenary discussion where we say, what do we want to do? Where do we go from here? And try to answer as many questions as we can. And we are fortunate in that many of our key speakers from day 1 are also with us, so that we should have today's session is very interactive. So I'm going to tell you from in front, please post your questions, comments, suggestions, opinions, ideas on the chat. We are going to be taking note of all of them. We're going to try to answer as many of them as we can today. Whatever we can't answer today, we do promise to get back to you by email, so I'm sure we have all your information. And we really want to make it as interactive as possible, because we believe that anyone can have ideas. What we try to do is to try to bring to the table an informed analysis of ideas, so that together we can come up with the best way forward. All right, so that please feel free as you go through as you listen to the presentations of the panelists today. And the panelists are the moderators of our sessions from yesterday. Please feel free to certainly post your comments, post your questions, post your suggestions in those areas. But then we are going to be having a time at the end of the session, today's session, to have a plenary discussion where we're going to have all the panelists going to be available, and we're going to have some free-flowing ideas. And I'm confident that will give us sort of a path of how we go forward. So I'm not going to keep you very much longer, because I did say that today is mainly interactive. I want to remind you again, we are going to be doing a survey of all our attendees today, and we'll post that a little later on in terms of how you can access that survey. Feedback is always very important to us, because we are the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. We have a commitment to ensuring that what we do is relevant to society. We do not believe, and many people believe, that the university is all about airy-fairy research. Not at all. At least not in this part of the university. We believe very strongly in the power of research and scholarship to inform decisions and to improve the society. This has always been our mantra. We've done research in many areas, including we do research, we have not discussed it today, but we do research in areas like in highway materials and pavement materials and road design and stuff like that. We do research in building construction and earthquake resistant building construction. We do research in terms of water retention, water resources, and rainwater harvesting and stuff. We do research in a number of areas in civil engineering. And the whole idea is that our research, as much as possible, can inform the improvement of society. But today is not a day to advertise the department, although we can do so. Today is a day to get your feedback. in terms of the Transportation Symposium 2021. So that without further ado, I would like to ask our first presenter, who will be presenting on the topic of green transport mobility, Dr. Ryan Allard, one of our young, highly trained professionals in the transportation engineering field. I'm going to ask Ryan, who moderated the session, to share his screen and to open up his mic and to make his presentation. So Ryan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thompson. All right, good day, everyone. Day 3. Hope you're as excited as I am, and we all are, to end on a high note with today's topics. And we had some really interesting discussion yesterday in our workshop on green transportation. We discussed a range of perspectives. We had a lot of very interesting debate, and we actually did want some more time, but that wasn't possible. So hopefully we'll get a couple more questions today, and we can move on with what needs to be done in Trinidad and Tobago for the transportation sector. So I'm just going to go through really quickly what we did, and then we'll have some time for questions afterwards. It was moderated, the session yesterday was moderated by myself, along with Shani Brathwaite and Dr. Felix. And we had, as I said, a lot of input from others. So their names aren't on the slide, but they, of course, should be thanked for the input yesterday. So we're just going to go through a quick structure, a very easy structure, hopefully. Just kind of making sure we're all on the same page of what is green transportation. Then kind of review the framework that guided us yesterday, so you understand what guided us. And then we talk about the actual issues and the solutions. So what is green transportation, right? Green transportation for us is defined as issues, or rather the issues that we focused on were those that touch these 4 areas, right? So energy, fuel, greenhouse gas emissions, and other environmental impacts. Because we knew that there are other workshops, other groups that would be focusing on related areas. And we also know that some of the items listed here do overlap, right? But the idea is to make sure that we're very focused on the issues that relate to the environment in some way, right? The Avoid, Shift, Improve framework was an approach we used to ensure that our solutions were very broad. Now, interestingly, Mr. Mohammed presented on Monday a very similar framework, the Curb, Shift, Develop framework, which basically aligns with what we had here. And just to make sure we're all on the same page with this, we're looking for approaches that either they avoid the need to do any kind of transport at all, right? Or they shift to more efficient modes, more space efficient modes, more energy efficient modes, etc. Or they improve the technology of the vehicles themselves, right? So this is already internationally seen as the standard approach to making transportation systems more sustainable, more efficient, and certainly more environmentally sound, right? So let's dive right into the issues as we saw them yesterday. We didn't have enough time. We tried to do as much as we could in that time. And as I said, we had a lot of discussion, a lot of fruitful suggestions of how these things can be addressed. But the number one issue that came out in that discussion of what the issues were really was this excessive dependence on private cars, right? We had a question about whether we should call it motorized transport, whether we're depending on motorized transport, and that is the issue, or it's simply having private vehicles, but something along those lines. So as we phrased it there, we try to capture the essence of that key problem. Why is that a big issue? Why is that the first issue we want to talk about today? If you look at what that causes in terms of the transport system in Trinidad and Tobago, that causes excessive cars on the road, which we all are experienced with. It causes low occupancy of these vehicles. It causes lower than optimal demand of the public transport system, right? So not as many people as could be using the existing system are using it for various reasons. It causes excessive emissions. It causes very high energy demand, including fuel use, etc. And it basically has a significant impact on the environment, right? Now, obviously, this issue will have knock-on impacts on other sectors, the other parts of transportation which we didn't focus on. So we would expect that that would come up in some of the other groups. So when we broke down that issue, what you see on screen there are some of those bigger elements that we wanted to spend some time on, right? Obviously, the low adoption of public transport is one of the bigger ones, one of the bigger problems. And just to make sure we're on the same page of how we define issue, problems, and challenges, the issue was the overall area that needed to be improved in some way, right? The problem or challenge, that definition you see there is relevant, right? So what causes or what hinders progress in that issue? So as you see the 5 items listed there, or the 5 bullets listed there, we thought that those were the key elements that enabled or hindered progress on that issue of high demand for private motorized transport, right? So a low adoption of public transport, right? We know that public transport, particularly buses, trains, we don't have trains in the country, but anything that moves as mass transport has to be attractive to travelers, right? Around the world, high adoption is generally encouraged or generally possible, high adoption of mass transit, when the system is seen as a very attractive option for mobility, for getting around. The thing is, in Trinidad and Tobago, we're not seeing the high levels of adoption because the system is not as attractive as it could be relative to alternatives such as motorized or private motorized transportation systems. So we think that that attractiveness of the PTSD system, the bus network, etc., is a key element, a key opportunity for improvement, right? Now, a related element to that, of course, must be, I would say, one of the 2 elephants in the room here, which is low adoption of non-motorized transport, biking or walking. The other elephant, of course, being low adoption of public transportation, right? Now, low adoption of biking and walking, it's something that we know that's the case in this country. We know that we have no recent history of adoption of biking and walking. There is an older history. If you go back far enough, you will see quite a bit of adoption of bikes and certainly walking in Trinidad and Tobago. But as we have forced or encouraged motorization, that has over time deteriorated. So what we see today is very few people using bikes, very few people walking as a means of transport to get to their destinations or do their activities on a daily basis. There's also limited data, right? And this is certainly a problem for all parts of transportation systems. We're kind of stabbing in the dark regarding transportation systems here. Certainly regarding green transport, we just don't know, right? If you ask for the number of vehicles, the number of liters of fuel consumed. In some cases, you can get that, and we can see some of what Mr. Mohammed presented on Monday, indicating that some bits of data are available, but for doing the kind of detailed transport planning that's needed is just not the case, right? Now, obviously, as I indicated on one of the earlier slides, avoiding transport is a key element here, right? That's a key way of making a more efficient and a more sustainable system. But to do that, you typically need to have high adoption of digital technologies to enable people to perform some activities from home, right? That is not as easy as it could be right here in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, one silver lining, I suppose you could say, of the COVID-19 pandemic is that we are now forced to digitize our systems. And for instance, today's event and the last few days we've been having, it has been enabled by that shift towards digitizing everything. But the case of the kind of services that we need in our day-to-day basis, in our day-to-day lives, including education, banking, etc., those are not sufficiently digitized. So that's a key problem that enables the demand, the dependence on cars, particularly private cars, all right? And finally, the infrastructure itself, just encourages the use of private cars because that is seen currently as the most high priority mode for moving our populace. So when we dive into the solutions for these, we think that one of the most important things has to be the leadership of the sector, right? We need to make sure that the entities that exist are either morphed into entities that can better able manage the complexity of the transportation system, whether that means a transportation authority or something that can can actually manage how these different modes of transport interact, or the PTSC is given more authority and more legal basis and resources to do the kind of management of the sector that's needed, right? So we know that PTSC could probably benefit from more financial resources, more human resources to enable the kind of transformation needed. But also, national data needs to be collected. We know that in the past, several transportation studies have been started. We know that there were issues with many of these. We don't have a consistent set of reliable data saying, for instance, where people are going, where people that live in the East-West corridor in the South, wherever in Trinidad and Tobago, where are they going on a daily basis? And how can we design a system that matches their needs? That doesn't exist as yet, as far as I know. So we definitely need to get that data and use that data to revamp the bus service. I think there are two big ways that needs to be done. We talked about yesterday having a service that's more attractive for travelers. So no longer is it an automatic option that I drive because actually the bus service is pretty good, all right? So now I feel like, well, I have some options now. So that means a lot of different things. That means that the service needs to go where people are going. It needs to start where people are coming from. It needs to be with a schedule that people can understand easily, with a route system that people can understand. We talked about the importance of attracting the youth, right? Because these days, the bus service is typically patronized by the older folks. And sometimes that's because they don't have any options, right? So we want to make sure it's attractive to people who do have options, such as maxis, taxis, etc. Now, the other part of improving the bus service is that the operations need to be improved. I heard a rumor that we have something like 30, 50 different models of buses in this country, which is just untenable. It's not sustainable. So when you think about if we want to learn from other sectors, such as the low-cost aviation sector, when you think about the changes that they made to reduce their costs and make their systems more efficient, one of the big things they did was simplify the number of types of airplanes they use, right? So what that does is it reduces the cost for maintenance, it reduces the training needed for their staff, it reduces the systems and technologies needed to support those vehicles, aircraft in their cases. In our case here, it's buses. It's a similar process. So what we see now is a need for redundancy in the support systems, and the maintenance for the buses suffers. That needs to be improved if these systems are to provide the quality of service needed to attract people away from their cars and improve how environmentally sound our transport system is. And finally, on this page, the walking and cycling as a mode of transportation. We do know that there are people that walk for leisure, cycle for recreation, but as a mode of transportation, that is not the case. In fact, if you look at the hierarchy of how transport planning is done in the country, I don't think, and I'm not seeing evidence that there's a strong emphasis on cycling and walking as an option. And luckily yesterday we had quite a few, I don't want to say hardcore cyclists, but we had many enthusiastic cyclists yesterday that allowed us to get a good perspective of what's needed to encourage more cycling, right? So that needs infrastructure. It needs, awareness, cultural awareness from drivers, from cyclists, how to cycle safely, and others, how to share the road, right? Because as I said, the hierarchy now is the car is king. And that, of course, is not great for having a system of streets that encourage people to use multiple options, right? If you look at some of the stakeholders needed, you realize this is a very long list, and actually some names are not even listed on this list. What we see is that it's very extensive because the number of ways that transport in general, and certainly public transport, touches the society is so broad that the number of entities, institutions, groups that need to be engaged in some way is also broad. So taking one example here, we talked about the importance of having, for instance, a technologically enabled bus network. For that to happen, we probably need to have connections with the telecoms as listed here, be mobile, digital, right? If we're talking about improving the quality of streets so that people feel safer walking, right? And that includes, the lighting for the streets, for instance. We therefore need to go to the lighting provider on those streets, which in this case is T&Tech, right? So there are several entities here, and we think that there may be a need to even further prioritize or stratify this list in order to be more specific for specific projects. If you go on to issue number 2, which we did have a bit of time to develop, we know, just as Mr. Mohammed mentioned on Monday, the issue of low adoption of alternative fuel vehicles, which includes here compressed natural gas, hybrid vehicles, and electric vehicles mainly. There are other, other models, other types of alternative fuel vehicles, but we focused on those since those are the most highly adopted in the country, right? What we found is that there's a high relative cost for these vehicles compared to you can easily get a foreign used car, which is a gasoline car, diesel car, and you can get that at a pretty low cost, at least in the past. That has recently been changed because there seems to be some sort of economic driver, which is maybe finally aligned with the goals of cleaner transportation. So the government has changed its policy on that. But in the past 10 years and more, we've seen a very different policy, which is one to encourage ownership of vehicles, which are gasoline vehicles, encourage driving because of the low cost of gasoline, etc. And you can see the numbers there for how large that subsidy was. I think the number peaked at about just over 2% of the national GDP as a subsidy for fuel, right? So that was just simply unsustainable. And what it caused, though, is that for many years, the waiting that consumers had in their mind was cheap gasoline vehicle and expensive alternative fuel vehicle, right? So that was a main problem, which caused the numbers we see today. But there are also low incentives and awareness. We know, as Mr. Mohammed mentioned on Monday, that there are incentives, but we think that the incentives and awareness still needs to be promoted a bit more to ensure that everybody who can make that change, that conversion, for instance, of their vehicle to a CNG vehicle will do it, right? With the right incentives, that's possible. And finally, the inability to get access to some vehicles. So that was actually mentioned also, because mainly now of the COVID pandemic, international, logistics change are disrupted. It makes it a bit harder for us to get them. So moving forward to solutions for alternative fuel vehicles, certainly the most obvious ones come up, right? Reducing the relative costs here, which is either you increase the cost of internal combustion vehicles, ICEs, or you reduce the cost of the alternative fuel vehicles. And we think that some combination of two of those can accelerate the adoption of alternative fuel vehicles. We also think that improving the incentives and improving the awareness of existing incentives is important. We've seen in many other renewable energy sectors in the country that even though incentives exist, the awareness and adoption remains low. And part of that, of course, is because the traditional option is still very low cost, right? So there's no driver, there's not enough driver to get adoption of the renewable or the more environmentally sound option. And finally, we think that the infrastructure needs to be expanded. Now, Mr. Mohammed did mention this on Monday, which is great to see. But I note, for instance, that there's no CNG in some parts of the country. So there's still a bit of work to be done. I don't believe there's one in Tobago, for instance. So that makes things challenging for certain regions. Now, we did not have enough time to go into the details of some of the other issues, but we did mention them quickly. So that might be one of the next steps that Mr. Townsend Dr. Townsend will talk about at the end of today's session. So we did note that there is an environmental impact way beyond, climate and just low adoption of vehicles, low adoption of alternative fuel vehicles. There is an additional environmental impact of transportation in the country, right? Number one that we want to talk about, of course, is air pollution, with the WHO is indicating that about 500 people die annually in the country as a result of poor air pollution, right? We're talking here about ambient air pollution, not even household air pollution, where there's a separate number of deaths. I think it's about 300 or so. So the thing is that we do have some issues that, if you think about the number of people that have died from COVID-19 over the last 15 months or so in this country, it still pales in comparison to that figure. So air pollution is an issue that we don't talk about enough, and it's worsened by the transportation that we have in the country, right? We were not able to develop the solutions to this section yesterday, but that is one of the follow-on jobs that we think needs to be done. Obviously, the key stakeholders here would include two of these mentioned here, but we weren't able to develop them further than that. So in summary, this is what we see as the method of improving the transportation system on the perspective of environmentally and green transportation, right? There needs to be a reduction of the dependence on private vehicles, private transportation. And this is particularly important when you consider how many people travel in these vehicles, because of the high adoption of gasoline vehicles, the high adoption of private vehicles generally. Households have 2, 3, sometimes 4 cars. Each adult in a household uses their own car. Nobody shares a vehicle. So those are issues that needs to be improved. So public transport, we think, is one of the key ways of doing that, improving adoption by making the systems more attractive. We think that there needs to be a prioritization of alternatives to private car. There can no longer be this hierarchy of private car before everything else, right? We need to be able to share streets, and we need to be able to encourage adoption of other options. And we think that collection of data is very important for doing any of this planning. Otherwise, we'll be stabbing in the dark, right? Now, we think that in order to adopt more of these alternative fuel vehicles, specific actions can be taken. We think that the other environmental impacts of transportation also need to be taken into account. We highlighted just for a few minutes the air pollution issues, but there are other issues such as what happens to waste oils from the country, waste transportation oils, what happens to old and derelict vehicles, where are they taken, what happens to them, what happens to the rusty bits of metal that come off of these vehicles, etc. Is that a crisis waiting to happen, or are we dealing with that in a fair manner? So just to give some forward-thinking thoughts here on what happens from this point onwards. We didn't actually talk about this yesterday, we didn't have time, but I'll just give a few of my thoughts here. We think that the action plan needs to be developed some more. The work we've done is a starting point for figuring out how we can improve the environmental sustainability of our transportation system. And we haven't gotten to the point where we have a specific and very clear action plan yet. So that work needs to be continued. We think that because of the vast number of stakeholders that will be involved, we definitely need to identify quick wins. We need to figure out what are the specifics that would be important for, say, the university, UE, to lead, what is possible for UE to lead, because obviously UE can't change the policies regarding transportation, but there are certain things that can accelerate, the rate of first of all, understanding of the importance of these issues nationally and the adoption of the right solutions. So once those are identified, we think that there can be some collaboration with key critical stakeholders for particular projects, whether it be the Ministry of Health, for, let's say, the importance of walking and cycling. It could be the Ministry of Transportation for doing a pilot study in certain communities. It could be youth groups for the importance or attractiveness of cycling or using mass transit, and certainly operators such as PTSC. So there are ways that some of these ideas can be implemented, and we think that the sooner we're able to get the ball moving, the better. Right, so I thank you for your listening, and we look forward to any questions and any interaction we have later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan and group, for that presentation. I think that you all definitely were able to pull together and pull together a very complex topic and try to, identify some of the key issues. Just a reminder to everyone that if you have any questions for the panelists, you can post them. Any comments to make, you can post them in the chat, and we will be glad to take them up. As I said, we have a short question and answer period in between each talk, and then of course we will have our plenary session at the end. Ryan, if I may pose a question to you in the context of that slide you put up on, and the same that Mr. Mohammed had sort of listed in terms of, is it curb?
Curb, shift, and develop, or avoid, shift,
shift, and develop. And you will, I take it that issue number one, you're trying to look at shifting.
So issue number one.
Right.
Yes.
So looking
Yeah,
at
so we use this as a kind of guide, a mental framework for how we specifically identify the solutions. But then we chose the solutions based on their priority for solving the problem.
nice. Okay. Well, interesting to note. Well, I have a question and then a comment. In terms of shifting in technology, because as Mr. Mohammed indicated very clearly, if we were able to shift our current fleet into CNG, it would make a very green difference, right? So that if that is the case, I'm going to ask the question this way: if since the government of Trinidad and Tobago is the largest fleet owner, when I say that, and when I say the government, I mean through its ministries, the police, TNTech, WASA, all the state agencies, the government probably owns more vehicles in Trinidad than any other entity. What would happen if they were mandated within the next year to switch to CNG as well? In other words, to implement CNG kits in what are essentially diesel and gasoline engine vehicles. Is that something which could make a low-hanging fruit, a sea change in terms of green transport in this country?
Interesting. I think so. I'm not sure of the numbers that the number of vehicles that the state controls, but we know that the total number of vehicles in the country is about 1 million, just over 1 million.
And
right?
the state probably controls at least 10,000 vehicles.
Okay.
At least 10,000, probably more than that.
So it could make an impact. Sorry?
Sorry, I said Mr. Mohammed may have some impact on that.
Yes. Yeah, so it could make an impact, but it's considering that we still have another 1 million vehicles to deal with, the impact would be limited to some extent, right? I think that mandate is would be an excellent step in the right direction, because it needs to be something that the entire nation sees as, first of all, it's happening. The government is putting its money where its mouth is. The government is showing that this is not a big deal, this is possible, and you can save money and you can have an impact on the environment. Why wouldn't you do it, right? So I think that is very important for that awareness element that we talked about, certainly. Yeah. And the impact on the emissions and savings, that's certainly a key benefit too that needs to be highlighted in the public domain.
And the government will be leading from in front.
Exactly, that's very important, absolutely.
Yeah. Ever the businessman Curtis has asked, who will pay for it? And my thought is that actually the cost of conversion, and correct me if I'm wrong, because he indicated, when they compare the cost of conversion to the capital cost of the vehicle, it's a small part. When they compare the cost of conversion in terms of the cost of the fuel that those vehicles are now using, because the government is paying for all the diesel and the gasoline that those vehicles are using, I am pretty sure that it can be shown to the Minister of Finance that it is worth his while to mandate that change. And he can in fact quantify the savings to the state. And as you say, it would set the example, because there is a lot of resistance to switching, you know?
Yes. And if I can make one more point before the next question, I think it's so institutions have an easier time using a full logical approach to making decisions, meaning that the savings over time will be valued when you make the decision of whether to make the switch or not, right? So, you have to outlay a certain amount of cost to make the conversion into CNG, for instance, but you save that money over time, right? And that is something that institutions, all the government institutes you mentioned, for instance, would take into account, and the Minister of Finance would see the benefit within 3-5 years or so. But the case for the individual consumers, we've seen evidence that people do not consider that saving in its full form when making a decision to make the conversion, right? So all they see is this large cost upfront, and they don't realize that cost can save them far more money over time. Now, one element is they just don't have the money upfront, right? And that's where the institutions that do finance, lending, etc., can be a key part of that, or the government itself. So you lower that upfront cost while allowing them to make the switch And then over time, the institution that provided the money also gets the savings or gets some of that savings, right? Now that's possible. We have international business models that we can look into to make this adoption easier.
Nice, thanks a lot. A couple of questions, and I'm going to get some of them in. Question about policies to encourage commercial and public transport fleets to switch to alternative fuel. I know that Mr. Mohammed may have mentioned the maxi taxi industry, and of course PTSC has been mandating or at least specifying CNG powered vehicles for the last couple of years. That number in terms of the fleet size by the Ryan is about 30 now, 30 units, 30 different types of units, most of which I don't think are CNG. But what about policies to encourage commercial and public transport fleets to switch to these like trucking companies? And
so I feel as if Mr. Mohammed is the best person to answer that question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, and good afternoon to all the attendees. So yeah, there's a lot of comments coming in this direction. Very, very quickly, so that we all understand the context. The government did have a policy that ended on December 31st, 2020, where 30% of all government company fleets must be alternate fuel vehicles by the end of December. And they did not limit it, of course, to CNG. It was supposed to be all types of fleets. Only some companies would have transitioned across significantly past that 30%, some state enterprises, but a lot did not. But why? It was a matter of also funding, having the funding. We also, as the NGC CNG company, offered to assist with conversions, and we had extended that ever since 2016 all the way into part of 2020. What we've discovered though is that a lot of state enterprises lease vehicles, so they actually don't own it. They don't have the right to convert it. It's part of the lease arrangements they would have outside there. And getting access to some of those operators to do that would have been challenging. And you mentioned again, Dr. Townsend, about commercial. And I think I would have explained this, and I thought it would have been clearly at the presentation. Because Trinidad and Tobago would have commercial operators that operate in private sector, manufacturing sector, and also the energy sector. In the energy sector, you are prevented from having natural gas vehicles on process plants. So they are not able to do that conversion properly. So somebody needs to look at the entire alternate fuel vehicle standards or practices for operating in heavy industry, because we may very well find ourselves up with the problem, not with natural gas vehicles already as it is, but also hybrids and also electric vehicles. Are they going to be allowed? Commercial vehicles allowed inside? So it's a bigger issue, Dr. Townsend.
But thanks a lot, Curtis. Yeah. I was thinking of companies like KISS. They have a tremendous big fleet, and Blue Waters and some of these companies. I understand that, as you said, that the companies that service the oil and gas sector in Point Lizas may have a challenge, but there are many fleet owners that service they have
been converting, Dr. Townsend. Even there's a little over 100 garbage company in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a disposal company. They have started the conversion, and I think it's a little over 100 garbage trucks are being converted right now. I think they finished somewhere between 10 or 20. They've started already. So it has been happening. It just has not been publicized for everyone to see.
And it probably hasn't been happening fast enough to make an impact as yet.
So because it's all economic, it boils down to economics as well. We can't, the NGC cannot and will not fund every single conversion. There's also significant motivation economically by the users. But as someone would have mentioned, that is not the normal. We don't think about investing to save money as a Trini. Transplant us in the United States or in Europe, and we start to think differently. But in Trinidad is very, very different. And I think a subsidized environment created certain habits. Okay.
That is so correct. And those habits are ingrained and have not yet been broken. But I think that there are some other questions in the chat, but we're going to have to save them for later on. Thanks a lot, Dr. Thanks a lot, Ryan, and thanks a lot, Curtis, in terms of your answers. And we want to move on now to the area of ITS in future mobility. And The moderator for that sessions were, well, the moderators were Dr. Julia Kotzebue and Ms. Kohan Dorsey. And I'm going to ask you now, Julia, if you can share your screen and unmute your mic and start your presentation.
Yes. So, well, thank you, Trevor, for introducing me. Oh, give me a second. I don't know why my system is slow sometimes. It does not work. Give me a second. Okay, now it works. So, well, our workshop was on information and communication technology, ICTs, and future mobility and transportation. As Dr. Townsend said, I'm Dr. Julia Kotzebue. I'm assistant professor at the University of Hamburg at the Institute of Geography, and I'm a guest researcher here at the UB in the Department of Geography. The co-moderator was Kohan Dorsey, but I present the results from yesterday. And it was really a workshop. It was almost a workout, or it felt like a workout. So I think one thing we struggled with was the nature of the issue. So ICT is an overarching issue. So it is related to all, we could say, to all topics we discussed in this workshop the days before. And so we really had to focus on ICT. So it is related, for instance, to quality of transport, energy consumption, safety of transport, environment, and we could even add more. And as the issue is very broad and it relates to all other issues, there are also the tools and the systems which are used. So, and they are constantly developed and new developments on the market. So there is the possibility of electronic exchange of data, telecommunication network is related and developments in that case, automatic identification systems, systems for automatically locating vehicles, the geographic information systems change. We have now Google Maps, and so it is a issue which is in constant and very fast and quick change. What we realized in the workshop was that what we were focused on was that the technology availability and the access to this system is in question. So if we look to the key issues, and they can be distilled from strategic planning from the United Nations, from the US, from the EU, then we see that safe mobility, infomobility, eco-mobility, data management, technology transfer, and cooperative mobility are very important issues. We ranked them and we decided to discuss these first three. So issue number one is safe mobility. Second, infomobility, and eco-mobility. So the guiding question with regards to safe mobility is how can information and communication technology and intelligent transport systems support the safety in transport and mobility. So, and this discussion was really much influenced by the crime situation in Trinidad and Tobago. So we rose or brought on table that it is important to have, for instance, vehicle tracking systems and using positioning technology to make sure that we know where drivers, for instance, taxi drivers are, or that clients could see where the users could see where the taxi is. We discussed the issue of public transit camera systems in the public buses, and even also in maxi taxi minibuses. And we also spoke about driver assistance systems. So what we realized was that the major problems or challenges was that there's little or poor investment of the government in ICT infrastructure and ICT in general. So this is related also maybe that there is a lack of I wrote transit also, a transport authority which guides this development and which gives a framework. But special to a small island state is also the market scale, especially market driven apps are dependent on the market scale. So they are developed for the big cities. So this creates developing costs. It creates, it is difficult for private investors to develop something under the aspect of economic sustainability. And then what we also realize is that there is a general lack of confidence and trust in, for instance, key actors like the government and investors, but also in technology. We asked, we made a cloud brainstorming and asked who's the major actor or a key stakeholder, and this came out. So there's still the focus on government. The reason was because there is a legal framework needed to create push factors for private investors, for instance, and also pull factors like incentives. But also important are maxi taxi owner, for instance, and drivers, and also it is which can encourage the use of ICTs, and this comes from the consumers. With regards to possible solutions, this was very heated discussed partly. And one solution is which was suggested was the creation of a governmental body for all public transport providers that creates a framework for operating the use of ICTs, monitoring and development. But there is also the need for public-private partnerships to guarantee the security for private investments and also lower public costs. There's also the need, or a solution would be really to come in action and to implement and to integrate ICTs, because it's a fast developing market. And in this part, the university has an important role. As possible solutions, we regarded university-led solutions, for instance, research partnerships with the private investors. With regard to the second issue, safe mobility, general comments. What the general comments with regard to safe mobility was that there is clearly an ICT and a technology development gap between, for instance, the EU and Trinidad, or America and Trinidad and Tobago. And what we already realized from the first presentation is that there is a high car dependency combined with the use of old second-hand cars with partly no ICT or outdated ICTs and technology. And this also limits the creation of an intelligent transport system. Then again, these low trust in technology limits the private investments in ICTs. And this again hampers the development of a smart transport system. With regards to the second topic, info mobility, here was the guiding question: how can ICT and ITS support the information of data? I call the data flow and in transport and mobility. And what came up the most or guided this discussion was real-time data. So real-time data from transport systems, users. It was, we discussed the dynamic traffic management, for instance, with Waze to choose alternative routes. the importance of these navigation systems, but also the data exchange, access, and availability. So the major challenge which we could distillate from this discussion was that there is a lack of, again, a lack of a responsible institution, but also a platform. And there was a call of a sort of conductor, seeing all these different parts as a kind of orchestra. And this conductor is responsible to create a frame for data collection, access, and transparency in data sharing. Again, there is a lack of ICT use in public transport, and there's no transparency and the guidance of what happens to user information and data. At the moment, this market is private, sort of private owned, but the user do not know what happened to our data. So this is a challenge for this country. Major stakeholders are again government, telecommunication authority, mobile phone providers, platform providers, fleet manager, consumers, especially end users and riders and drivers. So as a possible solution, we saw that it would be important to create an environment for private investments and for public partnerships. But it is also important to create a collaboration between the operators which are already there for data sharing, for instance, with university, to create these frameworks and these environments. And it is important to implement policies and to encourage public and private participation and promote ICT and transport systems. So the general comments on this topic was that Trinidad is in a kind of transition, and it is developing its intelligent transport system. But it is also catching up. And this is related to high costs, for instance, using apps, high costs with regards to data access or data storing. What also is typical for this island is that apps might not develop for the small island situation. They partly do not work, simply do not work in this context. So Trinidad and Tobago has to adapt, and this is often related to high costs. Then with the third topic, eco-mobility, here was the guiding question: how can ICT and ICTS support green transport? I call it green transport and mobility. So everything which is related to lower CO2 emissions or avoiding transport, for instance. And here it was also, it was again this topic of having green information. So one thing is we need the real data for the reduction, for instance, of congestions. There is the possibility to have efficient transport, for instance, optimize passenger numbers. There is the possibility to collect fees to stimulate a cleaner car use and to use apps for smart and green behavior. However, not all these smart or the used systems create green transport. So what in fact is that there is a lack of consumer awareness. We might think that an app helps us. Maria gave this example that Waze, Waze shows there's a traffic congestion, but instead of staying on the highway, people start looking for alternative ways and driving around. So this creates more traffic and more noise pollution, for instance, in living areas. So there's also a lack of supportive and legal and regulatory framework that enforces to have the green aspects on used apps, for instance. And what we also need is this finding early adopters. Maybe this fits to what Trevor said. If government would change the fleet, this is we need some powerful actors which would like to adapt and which would lead. If we look to the stakeholders, then we see again here operators, consumers, the Ministry of Work and Transport, and the government in general are the most important stakeholder in this aspect. So possible solutions are is to creating and implementing a national policy, creating again a supporting legal and regulatory framework, but also very important is that there is a public awareness rising and education, and this education might start in the youngest, in the preschool age, when children still walk, but become car drivers in future. There's also the need for the adoption of measures which are proven to be eco-friendly, and also maybe to assess apps and to have a sort of quality assurances for these apps to guide consumers and to create trust. So the general comments is maybe also the summary and the final perspective on this whole topic. ICT can play a role in foster green transport and mobility. It can also foster an intelligent transport system and improve the management. But Trinidad and Tobago, the government, all actors, all stakeholders, government, industry, university, people, must take the responsibility and must commit to a green mobility and also to use and support this direction and development. So this is maybe a good word to finish with. So I thank you very much again for the workshop, for all these contributions. Again, for those who participate on this last day, and please, if you have questions, write them in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. And the couple questions, because you mentioned that you looked at 3 issues, and issue number 1 was the issue of the use of ITS to improve the safety of transportation. Yeah. Is that what you is that you think the lowest hanging fruit in terms of how we could use ITS? And I'm putting it in this context. I have heard some people talk about ITS in Trinidad as being red light cameras and spot speed cameras. And I guess those are applications in terms of enforcement and vehicle safety. But is that where you think we should be looking at, or should we be looking at personal safety in terms of how we can use ITS for information about various things? Because with the recent upsurge of violence against some passengers, female passengers, there has been some interest in using apps like that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it is always a little bit a danger to isolate topics, because ICT is a complex topic. So if we would say we increase the number of cameras, it would be the same to say we give more weapons to security persons only. I think this will be not the only solution. It needs also a framework and also education, maybe. So when we speak about violence in public transport, or when they use private vehicles, ICT can provide and contribute to a maybe safer environment. But education is also a part. Children and women have to know that they might not have to go or to step into a car from persons they don't know, right? But ICT can provide a solution when you have, for instance, these carpooling apps. They can help when drivers and consumers use them, and when it becomes economically also visible for the users. Because imagine, and you have to take in mind that the most people here in Trinidad are car drivers, and those group who use public transport are those either who share their car already, show greener transport behavior, or they don't have a car. And those also cannot afford to have, for instance, high costs to taxi apps or to mobility apps. We have to regard it in its complexity, not pulling one single string, because then we will have side effects, obviously.
All right, thanks a lot. Another question which came up was the question of to what extent could ITS be used for instance, the bus company, if it could have its schedules published online or have real-time information in terms of its current bus operations, would that help to promote more bus travel? That's one of the questions which came up.
Well, we had that questions in the workshop as well, and we had two examples for these. In Maria's case, it was a revolutionary step that private buses, which were owned privately, were enforced to stick to schedules in order to create a more scheduled system, and in order also to provide consumer information whether a bus is behind the schedule or whether not. This was already a difficult step. And I gave the example from Barbados, which in Barbados, they introduced a system which runs without a scheduled system and tries to track the buses on the road. But this caused a lot of problems with the end consumer devices, because many people did not have the smartphones which could work with the amount of data. So what you need consumers which have the capacities on their smartphones in order to use such a system. This again shows the complexity of the issue. These users usually who use public transport are used either who desperately wants to use them, or they have to use them, and they probably might not have the financial capacity yet to buy new mobile phones or to always have internet access with this amount of data. So we could ask government, this was again a request to government to make the access to data a sort of public good, and to provide free internet on more spots so that these systems would work. But again, you see here again this complexity.
Yeah, in fact, I see Maria's here with us. I don't know if she perhaps can add from her own experiences as they try to revolutionize the use of ITS in Malta. To what extent was the issue of the cost of devices and data a significant stumbling block?
Well, there are a number of issues. Once the infrastructure is in place, so there's an initial investment, then the data availability is really easy, and then the distribution of data is even easier. So I remember the public operator of our public transport system coming to the university and seeing some new screens we had put up at the entrance of the university, and he said, "Why don't you put the schedules of the buses on those screens?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, "Is it difficult?" He said, "No, it's really, really easy. Once we have the data, then we can share." So the requirement of the real-time data was included in the contract to the operator. There was a requirement for the development of an app, which they did eventually, with variable success, I would say, also because of the issues that Julia mentioned. So we have our modal share for buses, I think 11% of total trips. Is really, really small. And if you look at the local population, it's mostly older people. So they don't have the smartphone access or would be able to navigate it really cleverly to find the best bus stop or whatever. So there are issues with technology and how pervasive and how effective it can be. But then there was also a requirement that on major stops, on major nodes, the operator would put up variable message signs. So these are those message signs that sort of go through with information. And those were the signs which sort of said number 40 bus is coming in 5 minutes, number 30 bus is coming, and so on and so forth. So there is an initial investment, yes, and it has to be, it has to be coordinated with the operators, because if you try to do it outside the operations, then it doesn't work. But once the initial investment is there, the system improves and the information improves. And over time, of course, people, get used to the information. We started off with printed schedules on the bus stops. But for all intents and purposes, we had been living with what I called inherited knowledge about the use of the bus. We never had schedules. So we didn't think that people would not be able to read schedules. Who would have thought? So, and yeah, it was an incredible journey of change. And 10 years now down the line, and we are still learning the complexities of revolutionizing public transport.
So if you were to, let me just take on this, Maria. If you were to say, given what we've discussed in terms of and your own experiences in terms of initiating ITS in a small island state, where should we start? Because Julia gave a long list of all the things that we have to do.
Yeah, I think you can start with what you've been calling the low-hanging fruits. So if you want to start engaging, say, for example, with a particular demographic, you can easily start with the younger ones. One of the things that is very important is to break the chain of car dependence. We have children, I have students that have never been on a bus at the university, or have hardly walk or know their neighbors, just because they are so car dependent and they've been chauffeured everywhere. So we have these issues just like you have, basically. But what is important is to start targeting these individuals to try and break the cycle of car dependence. And so free public transport to younger people, technology-driven initiatives. So get them to play with their phones, get them to provide information themselves about the public transport, and get them engaged with public transport, even through gaming, which has been quite successful in some instances to engage younger people. And slowly, you start seeing that people tend to basically engage. Once they are engaged, they will try and use it. Of course, in parallel, there needs to be an improvement of the service. Without any improvements in the service, it's very difficult. And for that, you need a political champion. You need a champion that will initiate the change, will identify what the issues are. And in our case, it was the then transport minister who published a document which he wrote, allegedly, overnight, saying, we've had enough. This country needs a change in governance of public transport, because we had a sort of a monopoly. Actually, it was a cartel, but it was a monopoly. We had bad service, we had old vehicles, we had declining patronage, and that recognition came very clear at a very, very early stage. And that kicked off the whole thing. So that is where the whole thing exploded, when that document came out and the national strike happened, and we started the process of change. So, but the low-hanging fruits are clear.
Low-hanging fruit, as you say. And I like the idea of starting with young people who, as you say, and you mentioned young people not even knowing about the bus company and that kind of stuff. Although we have a slightly different, because we do have our privately owned maxi taxis, and we do have a fair amount of young people who already take those maxi taxis, so that it might not be so difficult. Julia, last question.
Yeah, I would like to add to Maria that we need these front runners. This is very important. So until now, the most don't find walking and bicycling, I call it sexy. right? A car is sexy, bicycling, walking not. It's hot, uncomfortable, although it creates a healthy body. So what we see in other nations where a lot of bicycling is, a lot of walking is, that even stars, politicians who can afford a car, who could easily drive a car, but they're not doing it. There must be a conceptual change. For instance, the prime minister or in the Netherlands, or even high bank managers, they use their bicycle. They have rooms where they can get a shower after bicycling and then start in their job. It is a whole campaign driven by companies, by government, to change these attitudes that the car is the best possible technology to be mobile.
All right, one last question, and it's an interesting one from my colleague. Because we have the maxi taxi system, we have the shared cars as well, taxis, even taxis. How can we use ITS and ICT to integrate somehow the services of the private and the public-owned system? Or do we have to have that MAAS operator, what we may call the transit authority or something like that, that can use the technology to integrate that? Any, Julia or Maria? Go ahead, Maria.
Would you like to respond on it? Yeah.
Go ahead, Maria.
Shall I go first?
Yes, why not?
I think yes, you can have that. Today, the systems allow you to allow for integrated ticketing, which is basically what you fundamentally need when you have public services and private services. So now, for I think a year or two, we're seeing our public transport operator, the one that has the concession to run the scheduled service, operating with other services. So it's operating with the ferry services. Now it's going to start operating also with Virtu. I think I saw the Virtu ferries in one of the presentations on Monday. So it's all about really and truly finding collaborations and encouraging or getting the operators to see the value of integration. And then, because of course, if you facilitate going from one operator to another, and therefore facilitate the interchange, you avoid or you reduce what is called the interchange penalty. Once you reduce that, and that comes generally from people having to pay and pay and pay again, people, as long as they pay from a card or whatever, they don't see it. But if they're paying cash, even if it's a small amount every time, they don't like that. And so if you try to integrate these systems by getting the operators together, and that has to be a role of a government or a central agency that oversees public transport, because there's also needs to be some form of regulation of quality of service. So I think having an infrastructure that allows for the setting of rules to a certain extent, but rules that encourage integration, then the technology exists. You know, credit card companies would jump on the opportunity to have integrated ticketing for anything today, because it's become such a money-making business that it's taking over almost, you know, the interesting part of doing public transport and just going for the money.
Money part.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's we're gonna have to end it there for now, but we will get back to this discussion when we go into our plenary session. And as you mentioned, the whole question of trying to create safe transport, I think we can segue into our next section, which is dealing with road transport safety. And I'm going to invite Jerome Skinner to share his screen and to unmute and make his presentation from the road transport safety grouping. Jerome, over to you.